Hi, I'm Ann. Welcome back to my channel. This tag, which is kind of the top 5 English novels tag, was created in a discussion between Eric from The Lonesome Reader and Sarah from Hardcover Hearts, and the whole point of it was to look at what are the best English novels of all time. And so it was started from there, and then Shelly took the informal tag and turned it into an actual tag and tagged me. And I'm so proud of this because I'm pretty sure she tagged me like yesterday or the day before, and this is probably the quickest I've ever done a tag. I'm very proud of myself. This type of list is practically impossible to make, like 5 books. There's no way you could pick between all the great English classics throughout all of history. So Shelly suggested, why not narrow it down to certain parameters. So her parameters was, what are the best English novels that she has read since being on BookTube, which is a really good parameter. For me, I wanted to focus more on a certain era in history because even though I do like all of English history, I specifically love the Victorian era the best. So I wanted to focus on the books and the authors in general that I think are the best from the Victorian era. However, this will not be all the best authors because there's no way to encompass in 5 books all of Victorian English literature because there are so many great authors. So even though I'm picking specifically one book by these authors, I'm going to say that in general these are like the top 5 English Victorian authors that I love so much. So first of all, we have Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens is in the top there of all time. He's an incredible writer. He's written things like Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, The Tale of Two Cities. I just read Bleak House this year. Also, Little Dorrit is, I think, my personal favorite, even though I think Great Expectations is a better book in general. But he's written so many great books. And I picked this one just because I think it is possibly his greatest work. So this book follows Pip, who's this young boy. He's being raised by his aunt and uncle, I believe, and he helps this thief that wanders in on the moor, and he helps him. Pip also meets this very strange woman who lives in this mansion that is falling apart, Miss Havisham, and she is a horrible human being, but she's a very, very lovely daughter that Pip ends up falling in love with. So later on, he comes into a vast amount of fortune and nobody knows where it came from. He believes for most of the book that it is Miss Havisham actually helping him. And he ends up being educated and then coming back as an adult to seek the hand of the woman he loved, Estelle. You will notice that throughout most of these books that I'm going to be discussing, there is a common theme, and that is social changes. The Victorian era was an era where there were a lot of changes, whether it is in politics. There were a lot more women gaining more rights. We think of voting for women in 1919, but even before that, you have inheritance and things like that women were fighting for more rights. You also see a lot of worker rights. You see a lot of strikes and some riots where workers wanted better working conditions because working conditions, especially in mills and factories, were absolutely horrific. And all of this was caused mostly by the Industrial Revolution. So a lot of the books in the Victorian era that came out are commentaries on what was going on societally, politically, technologically in Victorian society and English society during that time. So you will notice that theme is in all the books. This shows that because you see how horrifically the poor are treated and how horrifically Pip is treated through the entire book. Next one. And I will say in general, the Bronte sisters, but I picked Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. It was my favorite Bronte sisters book, even though I do love Wuthering Heights. I have not read any one from, what's the third Bronte sister? You got Charlotte Bronte, Anne Bronte, Emily Bronte. So you have Charlotte Bronte, Anne Bronte, and Emily Bronte, and I have not read anything by Anne Bronte. But the Bronte sisters are absolutely amazing. They delve more into humanity and much more of the evils and the darkness within humanity. Most people know this plot. It follows this governess that goes to work for this man in this house. Because people don't realize this because they focus on the romance between Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester, who is the owner, who is her employer. But the Mr. Rochester doesn't actually, he's probably in the book for about half the time. He's not even in it that much. It is more about Jane Eyre's life and a fascinating understanding of her character. She is possibly, definitely in my top 5 female characters of all time. I absolutely love Jane Eyre. She is, on one hand, just this strong woman, but she's very kind and soft as well. It's quite strange to see a character that is able to pull off such contrary. And I feel like nowadays we have this expectation that women have to be like strong and gritty and able to fight and beat men. What you don't realize is that, like, yes, there are women that can do that, and that's fine. But for the majority of us, I appreciate the strength that I see in Jane Eyre in holding to her convictions and her morality while also still being more feminine. So I love this book. It's a great gothic romance, but it's also moving in the character of Jane Eyre herself. Next one, another romance, and it also focuses very much on the Industrial Revolution. That is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This follows this young woman, Margaret Hale, who travels to a northern city in England. She lives in the south, rural country, and she moves to the north to an industrial factory town that manufactures cotton, and she ends up falling in love with Mr. Thornton. Again, this book is not predominantly a romance. It is more so an examination of the conditions in these factory towns, but also understanding the perspective of both the factory owners and the factory employees. So instead of creating this idea that all factory owners were absolutely horrible, it shows them as people trying to make money. And yes, there are horrible factory owners presented in this book, but there are very good factory owners like Mr. Thornton that tries to make the conditions as good as possible in his factories. This is a fascinating book. I highly recommend it both for the characters and for understanding how the Industrial Revolution shifted perceptions in England during the mid-1800s. Also, Elizabeth Gaskell. I really want to read more of her books. She's an exceptional author and one I highly recommend. So those 3 are more like dramas and not specifically within a genre. The last 2 are more genre writers, and I feel like in the Victorian era you see a much more firm genre writing appearing because you have very different types of stories. During the Victorian era, there was the invention of the detective novel with Wilkie Collins. You have more of the idea of straight up horror. Of course, you think of Frankenstein, which was before the Victorian era because that was more in the Regency era, but you have a lot of the great horrors, like Dracula is the first that comes to mind. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is another example coming out in the Victorian era. But I have to go to the king of horror, and that is Edgar Allan Poe. Even though technically this is a book, it is the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe. There are a lot of his stories. I think if I were to pick one story that I think is my favorite, it's The Telltale Heart, and that is a short story. So technically it doesn't count as a novel or a book, but just anything by Edgar Allan Poe is so creepy because on one hand, yes, he has a very dark sense of reality. He gets into the minds and heads of murderers and evil people. So it's fascinating to see evil from his perspective. His mind was not always sound, and that really comes through in his writing. He was addicted to opiates, and he suffered from major depression. So that really comes through in his books, and I think that makes them so much better, his stories. So this is great, and I feel like he's one of the earliest examples of short story horror writing that would obviously be expanded on in the early 20th century with authors like H.P. Lovecraft or Algernon Blackwood, all these amazing authors that came after him, but he was really the first short story horror writer with penny dreadfuls that were coming out in the Victorian era, and this fascination of the Victorian era in general with these dark stories. You know, people were fascinated with Jack the Ripper in 1888 when he was on his murder spree. Even though people were terrified to dying, they were also fascinated by these like grisly deaths, and you see that exemplified in just how popular Edgar Allan Poe was at the time and also is today. And the last one, also genre related, is sci-fi. You don't really see sci-fi before the Victorian era. You do see obviously expansions in technology, but it's not so much in the sci-fi we think of nowadays. So I have to pick something by Jules Verne, and I go with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And it's funny reading this book nowadays because you see that, yes, certain things he got fully right on where technology was going for submarines, for example, but then certain ways he describes like the suit, the underwater suit that the characters use underwater. It's totally wrong with what we have nowadays. And all of Jules Verne's books are very similar like this, where they are both adventures as well as original sci-fis and kind of examining where could technology go. It is a great book. It's my favorite book by Jules Verne, but it's also very technical and sciencey to read. So if you go into it thinking it's going to be more of like modern or like very light sci-fi, it's not exactly that, but I feel like this was an example of early sci-fi that you see further propagated in the 20th century, especially. That's when sci-fi took off. I mean, just look at Star Wars from the 1970s. Even though people debate that that is also fantasy as well as sci-fi, because the Force is pretty much magic, but I digress. The whole point is that this book is a great book, and it also delves into like the sciencey aspects of the Victorian era, and it shows where technology was at the time, while also being imaginative and seeing where science would go in the future, which is now our past, which is really fascinating to read. So I really enjoyed finding these books. It's definitely a hard task because I feel like it's hard to pick 5 great English novels because there's so many, even Victorian novelists, and obviously I just took one about like a 60-year time period because Queen Victoria was in 1849 to like 1901, so it was a very short time period, and still I struggled to narrow it down to just 5 authors. But I've been talking way too long. I think I'm going to tag some people because I'd love to see what they think. And especially I'd love to see what subgenre they pick of English novel, whether it's what they most recently read, like what they read in the last year, or like I picked a specific era, like 1960s English novels, or like even looking at like modern fantasy books that are by English authors. Just anything like that. I think it would be really fun to just explore English novels. Fascinating. In fact, I think we should do that for every country on BookTube. I'm not going to start this. I just need to like chill a little bit. So I think I'm going to tag 4 different YouTube channels, but guys, no pressure in actually doing this. I'm actually looking at who Shelly tagged just in case I don't double tag anybody, but I'm going to tag Jane from Lady Jane Books. I'm going to tag Beki from Teacup the Storyteller. I'm going to tag Kari from Very Literary Kari. And I'm going to tag Joe and Mary. They can do one each if they want. If they want to do 2 videos, that would be awesome, from the Book Buds. So those are the channels I'm tagging, but no pressure in actually doing this. This was a really fun tag to do because you can kind of make it your own and just pick kind of like a subgenre or sub-idea to do for English novels. So have you read any of these books? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, like, subscribe. I post every Saturday and Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!